My very first marathon was horrible. It sucked. It was the worst pain I've ever been in my life, but at the same time, it was one of the most beneficial things that I had ever done because you can learn so much about yourself mentally when training for and running a marathon. So that's why I'm super excited to share with you my journey that I went through while running this first marathon. And at the time I wasn't YouTubing, so I don't have clips from the marathon itself. However, I really am excited to share the insights and things that I've learned while training for my first marathon as I'm currently starting to train for my second marathon. So I always told myself that I would never run a marathon. Like, I had the mindset of running sucks, running's painful, why the hell would I ever do that? I remember having to run in sports and do cardio and I was like, man, that's the worst part of it. And then when I got into high school, I got super into bodybuilding and the bro science of weightlifting. And I remember being like, oh, you can't flex cardio, why would I run? And there were points where I was trying to gain weight where I would actually deliberately not run or do cardio at all just so I could gain more weight. So really, I always hated cardio. But after being so specifically into bodybuilding for so long, I wanted to challenge myself more because I got so used to that. And so a combination of that and maybe watching a few Yes Theory YouTube videos with one of my best friends, Austin, we kind of looked at each other and finally decided, hey, screw it, let's run a marathon. Let's just see what we can do. And to be honest, this was probably really dumb considering the fact that I had never ran further than 5 miles my entire life, so clearly had never done a half marathon, and we said, you know what, let's just do a full marathon right off the bat. And so we decided, hey, let's pick a place to run a marathon, make sure that it's a really cool location. So we found the Nashville Marathon and signed up for that one, which was in 6 months. And that's kind of how we got started. And to be honest, that was our entire game plan. We totally just jumped off the cliff and planned on growing wings on the way down. It's kind of exactly what we did. Is the most important thing. We just signed up and then we knew that we would learn through the process and hopefully not be too stupid throughout as we trained for this marathon. So when I started training, I had no idea what I was doing. I didn't have running shoes. I didn't have anything, but I knew that a marathon was 26.2 miles. So the first thing I did was just got out on the street and ran a few miles. So I remember I did about 3, maybe 4, maybe 5 miles at a time when I was starting. And that's kind of where I began. To be honest, I took a very unscientific approach when I got started. I knew nothing about cadence or stride length or carb loading or any of those little nuance and intricacies as you think about marathon running, but I just got after it. And when you think of running a marathon, everybody thinks about race day, but the marathon is really about the process and the several months leading up to actually doing the marathon. So I gave myself 6 months worth of time for training. But in reality, I only trained for 5 months because Christmas time was right in the middle, so I took a month off. And looking back, I really did not do training right at all. My training schedule loosely consisted of this Nike PDF training schedule I found online, but all I was doing was running 3 times a week. So I was doing like 2 medium runs, which were about 6 miles, and then 1 long run every weekend. And so for the long run, I would just go up a mile at a time. So I remember starting at 5, then I went to 6, 7, 10, 12, until finally I had my longest training run, which was 22 miles. And one thing that's super important to understand about marathon training is that if you sign up for a marathon, you're going to want to do a lot of training. I know there's videos out there that are like, I did a marathon with no training. But if you want a good time, if you want to do it right, you're definitely going to want to train for several months. And because you'll be training, that does take time. So as you think about potentially signing up for a marathon, you have to realize that if you're going to spend time marathon training, you're going to have to spend less time in other places. So you might have to watch less TV, you might have to hang out with friends a little bit less, you might have to cut down on some other things, but that's one of those sacrifices you make when you're doing the marathon training. The marathon training wasn't easy at all either. There was a lot of social impact too. I was in college at the time, so it didn't make sense to stay out super late before a 22-mile run. So I had to cut back on that a little bit. I'd get up and run 16 miles before class, and then I'd be in class like eating a bag of Skittles and drinking a Gatorade half asleep because I was so exhausted. But those experiences were some of the most fun parts about the entire training process, is that I was making these really hard sacrifices for something that was gonna pay off in the end and be super rewarding. And as I progressed through the months of the training, I started to learn more and more. So at first I just got started and I knew nothing at all, but then I started reaching out to friends that had ran marathons before, getting advice from other people, going online and looking up different things. So I finally learned about things like carb loading, or the fact that I should probably hydrate during these long runs. I did a 16-mile run with no water, no food, no energy at all. And then I told a friend that I did that and he was like, dude, what the hell? You should definitely be drinking throughout, which I honestly didn't know. And looking back, admittedly, one of the dumbest things I was doing is I was so scared to lose weight and I didn't want to lose the muscle that I had from all of the bodybuilding. So throughout marathon training, which should have been my main goal, I was running 3 times a week, but I was still lifting 7 days a week. And I kept that up throughout the entire process. And ultimately, looking back, I realized that I could have done way better at the marathon if I would have prioritized my training to focus on the marathon running first and then put bodybuilding on a back burner and still do some of it, but I couldn't really get myself to do that. I also made a ton of mistakes on marathon weekend itself. So we decided that we wanted to save money and so that we would just drive from Florida to Tennessee the day before. And on top of that, we didn't want to get a hotel, so we stayed at a friend's college dorm, which the night before the marathon, that friend and all of their friends went out and drank a lot and were super loud, so we didn't even get that much sleep. But all that being said, we showed up for race day and the energy, the vibe was just fantastic. But I guess I should back up and say that we were literally almost late for our own race. We thought that we'd be able to catch an Uber. That didn't happen. We thought we could use the Lime scooters, but you could only get those so close to the starting line of the marathon. So we actually had to run a half mile to get to the marathon line in time just to be able to run the marathon. And because we were late, we had nowhere to put our stuff. So we had to take our bags and our wallets and our phones and just throw them in a ditch, like right outside of this church. So I'd recommend trying to get to the marathon line on time. That was a lesson learned for sure. And then running the marathon itself was such an experience. We started off feeling great, and as we ran, my friend Austin, he wanted to go super fast, and I remember telling him, hey, we should slow down, hey, we should slow down. But at the same time, we were having fun, we were talking to people, everybody had signs up, so it was just a great experience. But as we got to around the 20-mile mark, freaking Shelby Park, they put this huge hill there, and I just felt like I was being bullied. In Florida, there was no hills, but then in Nashville, there was hills everywhere, and they put the biggest freaking one on mile 20. Shelby Park, I will never be friends with anybody named Shelby. So at that point, Austin and I were both struggling super hard. Our third friend, Darren, who was the fastest of all of us, he had cramps, so he was left behind walking. And Austin finally split off from me around mile 20. That hill got him, so he slowed up a little bit. And I had to run miles 20 through 26 just with me in my own head, grinding it through. And those were the miles where I really wished that I trained harder. And I wish that I drank more during the marathon. I didn't start drinking water or Gatorade until mile 8 or 9. By the time I got to mile 20, I was so dehydrated, so dead. Never had to stop and walk, but I was moving like a zombie. My paces were getting slower and slower and slower, and mentally my brain kept telling me to quit, so I had to keep fighting that off. But finally, I got closer and closer to the finish line, and as I passed the finish line, I swear to God, I almost passed out. I remember seeing someone with Gatorade, and it just looked like gold, or like an oasis, and I just stumbled my way to that, almost fell into the Gatorade bucket. But I completed the marathon and felt fantastic. Now my goal for the marathon was to run the whole thing in under 4 hours. That's usually a pretty respectable time, especially for someone that's a beginner. And like I said, I was struggling through those final miles. I was at like 350, 355, like getting really close to the end. And I ended up finishing the marathon in 4 hours and 1 minute. And so I barely missed that time. In Florida, I was pacing a 3:45 marathon, but everything was flat. It was much cooler, the weather was, whereas in Nashville it was 80. So those factors combined, I just didn't prepare for. Because of that, I missed my goal by 1 minute. And no joke at all, after the race, it was the worst pain I've been in my entire life. Like my knees hurt, my toes hurt, my ankles hurt, my muscles hurt. It was everything. My insides hurt, literally like, it was hard to breathe. On top of that, my ego hurt a little bit because I missed my goal by 1 minute. So the whole experience was brutal. I could barely walk. I was like borderline passed out on this fence until Austin and Darren came across the finish line a little bit later. And after that, I mean, it was just a week-long recovery process. The day of, we ate so much food. We got Ben & Jerry's ice cream after, we got Nashville hot chicken. We just ate everything in sight. So that part of it was fun. But because I was in so much pain and barely missed my goal, I realized that I really should have trained harder. But all of that compiled on top of each other, and I just wanted to get back into bodybuilding, and I was so disappointed that after the marathon, I didn't run again, not one single run for 6 months straight. And I didn't realize it, but if you do all this training and then you stop running completely for 6 months, you kind of almost go back to the beginning, which really sucked because as I started to try to get back into running, I'd kind of lost everything that I worked for. But all that being said, I learned so much from this experience. I mean, I should have trained harder, I should have hydrated more, I should have learned more, I should have ran more and lifted less. There's a million different things, but that means that I know for this next marathon that I can fix all of those things and finally conquer that unfinished business, which is run a marathon in under 4 hours. And so this time around, I'm training almost twice as much. I'm training for several months longer. I'm running 6 times a week instead of 3 times a week. I'm lifting less, I'm learning more. And that is what is so exciting to me about this whole process, is it's a battle and it's hard, but it's the most rewarding feeling in the world after. And that's why I would highly recommend this to anyone. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you have any questions about marathon training, if you're considering one for the first time, feel free to reach out to me on Instagram at bsisarsky and just shoot me a message. I'm happy to help. I'm not an expert by any means, but at the same time, I'm accessible. I've learned a lot from the very first marathon I ran. I'm in the process of training for another one. So I'm happy to help. And if you found any of this valuable, if you want to keep up with my process of training for this next marathon, please consider subscribing to the channel and liking this video. And all that being said, I hope you guys all have a fantastic week and have success in accomplishing your future goals.